I just wanted some kind of guidance. And I didn't know anyone who had lost a sibling, or at least as far as I knew. And so a book felt like the place to go to find that. And then when I didn't find it, I took it as kind of validation that my loss didn't count.
Welcome to A Place of Yes, a podcast about how I moved through my darkest hour. And for me, that was in channeling my grief into good. Welcome to the show. Hi, my name is Heather Straughter. I'm the host of A Place of Yes. In today's episode, we talk with Annie Sklaver Orenstein, and we talk about sibling grief. I'm an only child. I don't really know a lot about siblings or that relationship, but I do know loss. I lost my son, Jake. This conversation was so profound and important to me because it helped me think about the loss of Jake from Ethan's point of view. Ethan is my other son. He lost his younger brother. This conversation explored really an underexplored topic. We don't have a lot of books or information out there about sibling grief or sibling loss. So I am grateful for Annie for being on the show, and I hope that this conversation is helpful. So I am here today on A Place of Yes with Annie Sklaver Orenstein. I was introduced to Annie through a mutual friend, Catherine Hover. I remember her reaching out and just being like, you have to meet Annie. Like, there's a connection. I don't know where it will be, but there's definitely a connection there. And I'm so glad she put us in contact because, like, I think there is a lot that you can teach me that is going to make me a better mother. And I look forward to this conversation very much. All of that to say, your book is called Always a Sibling, and you share the story of sibling loss. So you lost your older brother, Ben. And what is remarkable in this book is that it's not just, actually, there's a couple things. It's not just your story. You've got all these other snippets from other people's loss, really covering the gamut of everything. And then you incorporate your background as a researcher in this information that makes things really tangible and really concrete. So I want to welcome you to the show. I want to thank you for being here. I was just hoping you could then talk to the audience a little bit about your story, about why you wrote the book and about Ben.
Yes, absolutely. Well, first of all, thank you so much for having me and for inviting me on. So yeah, a bit about me. My background, as you mentioned, is in research. I have worked for many years as a researcher for big Fortune 500 companies. You know, I work at YouTube now, part of Google. So again, these like big, massive companies as a researcher. And that was always what I did. And it was very separate from my life and my experiences. In 2009, my oldest brother, Ben, was killed in Afghanistan. He was killed by a suicide bomber. At that point, that was actually before I had gone into research. I was in grad school and I went looking for resources. And one of the things that really stood out to me at the time and that I really haven't been able to shake since then was that I couldn't find anything. I went to a big bookstore with a big grief section and there was nothing for siblings. I remember looking in like the table of contents and like the index sections thinking maybe I would find something, a chapter.
Like even a paragraph, anything.
Anything. Yeah. I mean, I was looking for like baseline. My expectations were low and there wasn't anything.
That was one of the first things. And at first, when Catherine introduced us, I was thinking in terms of my son, Ethan. You know, so my son, Jake, passed away. Ethan was 5, Jake was 4. Jake was very sick. Like Ethan never remembered him prior to the seizures and his illness. So he only knew that his, younger brother was sick, but he was very protective. It's interesting when you were saying that and you were talking, like, I think it might have even been in the sort of in the very beginning, you kind of talk about one of the questions always like, how are your parents doing? That just resonated with me because that honestly is Ethan's world. One of the things in the back of my mind is for all that I talk about grief, I don't know that I've done a great job of giving Ethan this place. It's so interesting to me because there's so much out there. And like you said, you're like in a big box store, you're in a huge store, there's grief sections. And that there's nothing to even put a name to sibling grief seems shocking. But then the fact that I've, as someone intimately involved in this, hasn't even given a place for it. it's so important what you're doing. And I just think
Thank you.
I just think that sibling perspective, it's funny, like not funny, but you talk about how you lose your sense of who you are in a family to some degree.
Mm-hmm.
And I've said this before. It's like we went from a family of 4 to a family of 3. It's like a 25% change. It's,
Mm-hmm.
the dynamics shift. So can you talk about that?
My surviving brother lives in LA. He was here with his kids, and there was a lot of like, oh, we're all here, like everyone's together. But in the back of everyone's mind, we're all thinking, no, that's not actually true.
Yeah, that's not.
That isn't really all that we're missing. And I think that, even just what you were saying, that Ethan maybe never remembered him healthy, but they still had a bond, and he was the protector, right? And so even at 5, now he needs to renegotiate his place in the world. If his role was protector of his little brother, then what is he now? And what is his role in the family? And what does he do? And I heard that time and time again in these interviews. It's different, I think, if there was like illness versus some kind of sudden or traumatic loss.
Yep.
But certainly with illness, there was a lot of, I was the protector, I was the caretaker, I did all of these things, and now what do I do, right? This was my role in the family, or this was kind of my meaning. For some people, they felt like a failure, even though they knew that there was nothing that they could have done. I mean, I had the same thing because I failed to convince my brother to get out of his deployment, where I carried that guilt of that responsibility a lot. And it wasn't until years later I was writing the book, and I asked my brother Sam if he experienced the same kind of guilt. And he was like confused by the question. And I know that he also tried to convince Ben to stay home. Sam's response was like, I wouldn't have gone, but he was always going to go. We all know the hero's journey, and he was called and he went, and Sam never held the belief that he had that kind of power.
So it's so interesting because even in the same family, same sibling, the interpretation, the
same kind of conversations.
Yep. And the way one person
different things.
Owns it differently. There was someone else and I don't remember the name of the person, but they talked about when her sibling lost, she even felt like it was something that happened to her mom, like almost like it didn't happen to her. Mm-hmm. And as I was reading that, I was like, oh, I wonder if that's what we did to Ethan. You know what I mean? Like it made it like, I'm like, oh no.
Oh my God. I mean, I was thinking that about my own kids. I'm like, how much is my writing this book going to mess up my own children? Like, it was interesting because that sentiment, it feels like something that happened to my mom, is something I heard from multiple people. I think the thing that a lot of those folks had in common was that they were kind of young adults when it happened, and they were put in the role of having to be their parents' primary emotional support. And so all of their energy went into taking care of their parents, making sure their parents were okay, dealing with everything that needs to be dealt with. And so they never had the opportunity to stop and pause and consider what happened and possibly grieve that. And I also think there are cases when a sibling died younger and the parents just never talked about it.
Yep.
Packed the sibling stuff away, and that was it. Conversation's over. But yeah, that feeling of it's something that happened to my mom was often something felt by people who were put in a role where they were parentified and they never got to stop and think, I lost something also.
I never think of their personal impact, like what happened to them.
And then, in some cases, and this is one of the stories I tell in the book, was she didn't realize it until years later, when she kind of recounted this moment when she was with her mom and her other siblings, and her mom was able to talk about the deceased brother and smile and laughing and just kind of reminisce. And this woman I was interviewing said, I still can't say his name without crying. And my mom has this healthy, she can do this. And I realized that I never grieved.
Like never went
Everyone
through the
else has
process.
processed and I have not. I am frozen because I put myself on the back burner and I took care of everyone else. And now they're doing well. And I never processed any of this.
From your research and from your people, I that's got to be common, right? I mean, I think that, in the 13 years of my grief journey, I just feel like, who do we talk to? We talk to grieving parents. We do a lot with ambiguous grief. We talk about widows. It's like an overlooked dynamic. I'm so glad you wrote the book. I'm so glad that
Thank
you
you.
saw that what was missing and went to fill it. One of the things that I always try to do a little bit with this podcast, or some of the things that I write a little bit, is to try and provide, I don't know if support's the word, but provide something for what I didn't have when I needed it. And so I'm thinking of you when you're saying, like, I don't know what to do with because how old were you? You were a young adult.
I was 25.
So you were 25. You're trying to like navigate this new thing, and there's no one to help you. Like, there's no resources.
Yeah. And not only was there no one to help me, but the people who had helped me historically through any difficult thing in my life were incapable of helping me now, because those people who had helped me previously either were my brother Ben, who was gone, or my brother Sam, or my parents, who were grieving so intensely on their own that you don't want to put it on them. That was why I went to the bookstore, right? I thought I could find something, a resource. And I think now there is a lot more available. Even just, you can look on Instagram and find Instagram accounts dedicated to sibling loss, Facebook groups, right? And kind of find a community that way. I think I just wanted some kind of guidance. And I didn't know anyone who had lost a sibling, or at least as far as I knew. And so a book felt like the place to go to find that. And then when I didn't find it, I took it as kind of validation that my loss didn't count.
Okay.
It was like the experience of a grieving sibling, as you mentioned, is a lot of people asking how your parents are, but not a lot of people asking how you are. Then you go and you're in a big bookstore and there's nothing there. And it's just like the whole world is saying your parents need help.
But you guys are good. You're fine.
But you're good. And so it just felt like, I guess I'm being dramatic or something.
One of the things you said, so this was in 2009, and when Jake passed, it was 2010. And I have said a lot to people at that time, you did still go to the bookstore, right? And I'm a reader, so we have a bookstore in town. I always go to the bookstore. In today's world, you can find community for almost anything easier, whether it's TikTok or Instagram or Facebook. I feel like when Jake died, and honestly, even before he died, when he got sick in 2007, it was like I was the only person I knew that this had happened to. There was no connection. There were people who certainly cared about my family and cared about us and felt bad for us. There was a plethora of the people who felt bad for us, but there wasn't this ability to be connected to other people. Even since doing this podcast, I have found, countless, like your whole entire news feed can be all grief if you let it, right? Like there's so much out there.
And I have actually found I have like multiple Instagram accounts, because sometimes I can't be in the grief Instagram account.
It's funny that you say that, because I'm struggling with that right now. I'm struggling with that on multiple levels, because my Instagram was always my Instagram, and it was my work with the foundation. And then I separated those two, and that's been pretty good. But now with the podcast, and it's funny, my son is always like, Mom, your Instagram used to be pictures and posts of me. Pretty much. Like now it is all these other things. It's all too heavy. Like it used to just be fun stuff.
Because I had my personal one, and my children are younger. They're 9 and 6. I don't post their stuff publicly.
Yep.
And so I have my personal one that's a private account. And then I have my writing Instagram, which has gotten pretty sad. I have, 2 that are just dedicated to hobbies and interests.
One of the things you write about early on in the book is the idea, and I think it might even be the name of the chapter, but the no new memories. And that for me has always been, continues to be, I don't know that struggle is the word, because it's not necessarily still a struggle, but it's a point, right? Like you walk into my house and there are these pictures on the walls on both sides of Ethan and Jake, and I can't take those down. Like there's a piece of me that's I can't take that down. That's like a point in life. And there's throughout the house, but especially in the hallway. But if you continue through my house, you go into like the family room and the dining room and every place else. There's in one wall is all of Ethan's school pictures up until high school graduation. There's all these other pictures. And to me, it's kind of like the picture of this no new memories, right? Like everything stopped when Jake was 4, but everybody else is continuing to go on. I struggle with that. My husband and I kind of went back and forth and we kind of came up with our decision, but we were deciding like, is Jake 17 now or is he forever 4? Like we had these big conversations about how, what does that look like? And we eventually decided he was 17. Like, we kind of made this arbitrary rule that he has aged, he is 17, but it's hard when there's no new. And what is that like from the sibling perspective? Because I can speak to it certainly as the mom, as the parent.
With the book coming out and all the publicity around the book, I got asked, multiple times to provide photos of me and Ben. And I had this moment where I was like, I'm sick of all of these. I wish I could share a new photo, and I can't. It happens in weird ways. And the thing about the sibling relationship in general is that biologically, it should be our longest relationship. It starts before we meet any kind of partner, and it continues past the death of our parents.
Yep.
And so it should be our longest relationship, and it's a peer. A lot of people even, report that when they lose a sibling, they think they're going to die. Like they immediately just assume that they too will die because our lifespans are parallel. We are born around the same time within a few years, and we die around the same time. We are peers. And so I talked to a lot of people who are like, oh, I was just sure that I was, and logic be damned. I talked to someone whose older brother died of AIDS in the 90s and she was 15. And she was like, and then I just assumed I'd die in a car crash that summer. You exist together. And one thing, especially, that's I guess distinct for younger siblings, if the younger is the surviving sibling, is that at some point you become older than your older sibling. And that's I don't know if I can swear on this podcast.
Yes, I'm going to say it if you don't. Yeah.
It's a real mindfuck. It just, Ben was 8 years older than me, and he was so wise and mature and an adult when I never was. And then I was the same age as him, and then I was older than him.
I have found time and time again, sometimes you can expect those moments that break you and kind of tear you down. But other times you can't. Sometimes I'm like, oh, this is going to be tough. I am ready for it. I am here for it. And then I'm kind of like, oh, well, we made it through that day. And then other things trigger things that I couldn't see coming. One of the things for me, and I knew it was going to be difficult for me, but not at all because of Jake. But when Ethan went to college, dropped him off at Syracuse, full of emotion, just the empty nest, like all of the thoughts, it's like you're dropping off your baby, like all the very typical mom thoughts, parent thoughts, but then a few days into being home, I just wigged out. I was like, the energy in this house is weird. And then I literally could not, I couldn't escape that the last time I felt this way was when Jake died. Now, my rational mind knew that Ethan going to college and Jake dying were two very, very different things, not the same. But my emotional insides could not. I couldn't make it make sense. I didn't see it coming. I did not see that dark despair.
It can take you down. I had this experience after my first child was born, immediately after. My husband had no paternity leave. He took 5 vacation days, and he went back to work the day after the bris. We were living on the other side of the country from my parents, and they left and flew home the day after the bris. And I was home alone with the newborn. And I remember talking to my sister-in-law, and I compared it to after Ben died, when everyone was around for a week or two and then everyone else went back to normal. It felt so triggering that everyone was here and we were supported, and then everyone was gone and I was alone to figure out a new world.
When it does come, even for a reason that your right mind knows makes no sense, but it's almost that fight or flight, right? You're in that feeling and you can't decipher why that feeling is there. I so understand that. I just find it so offsetting when it happens. And I was mad at myself for some of it because I was like, come on, Heather, you know, this is not the same thing.
But it is, sometimes there's just like some weird element of it that triggers that memory. And there's nothing really you can do. Like you can't, I try so hard to rationalize it away.
Well, it's funny because one of the things that I also learned in your book, to backtrack a little bit, like I feel like I lived for a lot of my like grief journey in this very like sort of the normal, I call it like traditional grief, right? Like my son died, I am grieving. That is the name for it. We can live in the world of waves, all of those things. Mm-hmm. Sometimes I explored a little bit that ambiguous grief, you know, because people would say like when Jake got sick, you should grieve the life you thought you were going to have with 2 healthy boys. You should grieve his healthy, like those things. It wasn't until he passed and I sort of plugged along that I realized that I was dealing with some of that, but I didn't really do it. Your book had the most thorough list of types of grief that I have ever read. And I have to say, I'm borderline obsessed with them. Like I literally was like reading it. Like I was in the car, we were going to Boston and I was like reading on my computer. I'm like, ding, ding, that one. Oh, I think you have that one, Brian. I was like, I'm like diagnosing people. I'm super into it. I want to know a little bit, like, tell me about it.
I remember like a therapist telling me that I had like PTSD and grief, which I was like, well, I don't have PTSD. I wasn't there when he was killed. Meanwhile, yes, I did have PTSD.
But we're so used to things meaning something so specific.
Exactly. My mom at one point said to me, has anyone ever mentioned something to you called traumatic grief? And I was like, no. This was kind of early on in the process. So I looked into it more, and just from, a lot of the research I was doing, and the first one I learned about actually, I think was prolonged grief or complicated grief, which was something that really struggled with. Therapists had brought it up to me. What I thought was so helpful about them is we all grieve differently, right? And we say we all grieve differently and grief is so unique and blah, blah, blah. Yeah. Saying grief is really unique and everyone grieves differently to me, is different than saying there are 15 commonly recognized forms of grief that are not mutually exclusive. And so anyone can experience any different combination of those. And I am not a mathematician, but just saying that, I'm like, oh, that sounds like there's an infinite number of combinations, of ways that possibilities. And just because of how my brain works, that was more helpful than hearing we all grieve differently.
If you don't know they have names, you think you're the only one feeling it. Literally, I was reading and I was like, I never knew about that one. Bingo, yes. I'm still in that one. And
it helps you understand other people. To me, it just made it so clear, because the stages of grief, the 5 stages of grief, are not meant for grief. Like, they've been misinterpreted and misconstrued and all of these things. But the inadvertent harm that it did was it led everyone to believe that there are these same 5 stages that we all go through. And so it's the same for everyone. But for me, it really gave me permission to grieve in my own weird way that is a combination of all of these things and will continue to change. It was really freeing for me.
I think the freeing piece and the empathy, both of those I couldn't agree with more, because I do think, the whole concept of those 5 stages of grief make you feel like they are linear, and that when you complete one, you're on to the second, like, you know what I mean? Like, or at least for me. And then while people would say, no, it's waves and it's fluid, and whatever visualization or way that we are describing it, even when you're saying it comes and goes and it's in waves, it still feels linear, or at least it always did to me. So I'm 50 years old. I would say, like, my parents' generations, like different generations handled grief differently to begin with. And didn't talk it through as much as we do now. There wasn't all these grief podcasts. And like you said, grief can overtake your Instagram page if you let it. Like, there's so many places for that now, but that didn't really exist. So you kind of just felt like, sometimes I would feel like I was failing at grief, right? Because I was still stuck somewhere. But what I love about these is it just, like, you're right, it's freeing. It's okay. Like, it's fluid. We can sort of be here and then we can be here. And I do think it gives empathy, because you look at some of them, and so many times as a society, I think, right, we don't cut people a lot of grace. Like, we're just not, we kind of expect everyone to get through it and figure it out and handle it. And sometimes what is grief looks different. Like when you think of like the distorted grief, right? Like that's a real concrete name for something we all know is there. I'm a little obsessed with names for things. And I think this is part because Jake was never diagnosed with an illness. So it's always like we're always grappling for even all these years later, like grappling with, people would say, well, what did he have? And I don't have an answer. And all these years later, it still makes me feel kind of like, oh, like I just don't like it. So when I can find something that is identifiable, these are the characteristics and this is the name, it's just very like settling for me.
Well, and because all of this is so far out of our control, we have no control over any of it. And so like the more we have names for things and like common definitions for them, it is really helpful. And it's, I think, really clarifying, right? I remember talking to someone whose brother had suffered from alcoholism for decades. And she was saying that she felt like after he died, she kind of just felt relief. And at that point, thankfully, I knew about these different forms of grief. And so I asked her if she had experienced anticipatory grief. And she was like, oh, yes. And I was like, well, then I think you grieved when he was alive. I fortunately don't have an experience with addiction. And so that's not something that I could have otherwise known, except that I knew about these different forms of grief. For her, that like unlocked something where she was like, oh my God. And she was able to give herself some grace. That's why like knowing about these kinds of things makes it so much easier to be kind to yourself.
The more people who know and who read and who learn of these things, the more ways we can help people navigate this world. Everyone grieves different, right? Like that is how many times in your grieving journey do you hear that kind of thing? But you're right. It's not helpful because it doesn't mean anything. It's just sometimes, you want to keep things fluid enough so they're open for everybody. But I think people do better when there's a name, more information.
Mm-hmm.
I'm grateful for that list. I was like, oh my God, there's multiple pages. Yeah. Let me ask you sort of a loaded question, but when you think of Ben and you think of your growing up time and then you think of being a mother, how are all of those feelings connected or disconnected? Like I'm sure Ben impacts a lot of your parenting.
Mm-hmm. It's very hard for me having lost a brother. I can't imagine if I had lost a child, how that would impact. When my son was much younger, I was convinced he was going to die. And I felt like, well, my mom lost her firstborn, so I'm going to lose mine. I go back and forth between this assumption that something terrible is going to happen and this belief or hope that like maybe our terrible thing has happened and like we're spared. It was a big factor. And I actually heard this from a lot of people, but like when we were deciding how many kids to have, the only reason I wanted a third kid was because what if something happened to one of my kids and I didn't want the surviving kid to be alone, which isn't, for me, was not a good enough reason to have a third kid. And I have 2 children and I am constantly worried. I didn't give them a third. What happens?
What happens? What happens?
I guess the other pieces of it is I just think it makes me really sad to think that they don't have a relationship with him, and that he never had his own children, which I know he wanted, and he was a great uncle, and that they never got to meet him or know him. And so that's like definitely been a very like ever present part of parenting for me, is how to kind of help them feel like they have a relationship with him in some way. But mostly it's just a fear that one of them will die.
So I think it's so common with these significant losses. And it's really, you don't want to put the burden on your kids of what your brain is doing. So the difference. And you're right. Like, I so understand that. Like, I just, that trying to navigate it. And it is hard. You touched on something that I think about often, is like, we're navigating constantly this life. And the more time that passes and the more people like your kids, who are your kids, they're your most important people. They don't know your brother. As people come into our lives, I in my mind am always like people who knew Jake and people who didn't know Jake. There's like this divide, and it's just, I love to be around people who knew Jake. I value that in such a different way because it reminds me he was real. It's hard, right? It's hard for me to balance that I have this whole world of people who don't know him and will never know him.
And I don't know how often, you're asked how many kids you have. people don't ask how many siblings you have very often. There are a lot of people where I'm like, oh, they have actually been in my life for a while, whether it's coworkers or whatever. And like they found out that I had a brother because I wrote this book about it. It just wouldn't have even come up in conversation. Because if anything, I might reference my surviving brother, right? Maybe say I'm going to visit my brother's family's in town, whatever. Sometimes you get a follow-up question, sometimes you don't. Sometimes I just think if I meet someone and I think, oh, this is a new friend, I think they're going to be in my life. And then I think, well, and how do I tell them? And it becomes this challenge where, in the beginning, I certainly dreaded anyone asking, how many siblings do you have? There's a part of me that wants someone to ask because then I can introduce them to Ben in some way.
So it is hard, less so now because I'm older and because people know Ethan's older and stuff, but that it does come up. I hate it every time still. Sometimes it's, I'm shooting the breeze with someone at the grocery store. Like sometimes it's not a person coming into my life that I want to tell the full story to. Like sometimes it's just someone random. But what happens if I say, oh, my son Ethan, or oh, my son Ethan and my stepdaughter Serena, if I just say that and I don't acknowledge Jake, then I have this crazy guilt. I have run the gamut with my answers. Like I have sometimes said one, and then I feel terrible. Yeah. I once, like when Ethan was younger, like, I don't know, he was like 10 or something. I had this full conversation with someone where I was like, oh, I have a 10-year-old and a 4-year-old. I dug this hole of like crazy lunacy because I just couldn't and then I went home and I was like, Brian, this is insane. He's like, that's insane. But it's hard. Like answering these questions are hard.
Sometimes I'll say one. It's more rare now. More often I say two, but like, they ask what happened, or they'll ask what happened, and it's a real conversation killer. And sometimes I'm just like, I have two. My brother Sam lives in LA, and my brother Ben was killed in Afghanistan. And then it's like, would you like to ask me a follow-up?
Yeah. I dare you. Yeah.
I dare you. A lot of times people do. It is such a weird thing, but I think it is a question that is asked more of parents.
I think so.
A casual supermarket conversation, you don't say, how many siblings do you have?
Yeah. So I'm thinking about some of my friends as you say this, and I don't know, like one of my best friends, I know she's got a couple brothers. I would be hard pressed to tell you if she had 2 or 3, just because I'd have to think it through more. You're right. It's not as much of a topic.
Especially as adults.
Yes. I do think that is one of the things of grief, regardless of the kind of grief you're in or the type of loss you've had, that you never know what that question is or what that day is going to bring or where you're going to end up with it. And I think that one of the things I do think is that, when Jake first died, it was anger and it was raw and it was horrible. And there was that space for a while. And then you kind of figure out that life is going on and you've got to rejoin the world. And then you kind of plug along, at least for me. And then I did kind of realize that I still had a lot of trauma or stuff to work through. And you kind of alluded to it. When there's the 5 stages of grief, you think you're here, and then you're done and okay, I'm good. But that's not the journey. It's not the journey if it's a sibling or a son or a parent or frankly, a dog, right? Like I used to sort of think there was a hierarchy of grief. I used to sort of be like, no one understands any, but now I really very much feel I feel much different than I used to, because I do think loss is, I don't want to say loss is loss, but like that void, that whatever is making you feel that void because someone has left, and that concept, and some of the concepts you write about your book, like whatever it is, you're not having more memories. Time froze. Like time is not continuing. Our time is, like wrapping your head around that for regardless of who that is. I was talking with my uncle once and he was 77 years old or something. And he said, I know I'm 77. He's like, but it's weird to think I don't have a mom and dad. And I was like,
and even though it's the circle of life and that's the order of things, it's still weird.
It's weird. And it's still sad. And you still miss them and all the things. Like it doesn't make it less so. I know I've said this already, but I do want you to know how important your book is, not just for those of you who have lost the sibling as a resource, but I think for all of us. I think it's great that you wrote it. And I'm very, thank you for being on the show and for sharing your work and all of that.
Thank you so much. And thank you for having me. I think I have really hoped that this can also be a resource for grieving parents and helping support their children. So hearing from you and having this conversation has been really wonderful.
So we often do this segment at the end of the show that is called Ask Heather Anything. So do you have, Heather, anything you would like to ask me?
What do you like to do for yourself? Like to bring yourself joy?
I am in various places with that. And I think sometimes through this podcast and sometimes stuff, like I find myself talking all the time, right? And sometimes lately, what I find I need the most of is like, I need a window of time alone with like a book. And I need to, for me to be recharged, I need like alone time with like my book. Sometimes even just like alone in my house folding laundry, honestly. That sounds lame to say that that's like my me time, but
I get it.
I like to be alone in my house. I don't want the radio on. I don't want the TV on. I want like calm and quiet. Thank you for listening to A Place of Yes. Please follow us wherever you listen to your podcasts. If you really like this episode, please share it with a friend, anybody who might benefit from listening to this. It would make a world of difference if we could just reach more people and share the work that we do and the stories we want to tell. Please subscribe to our YouTube channel, leave us a thumbs up or leave us a comment. We would appreciate all that you can do. If you really like this episode, please share it with a friend or two.